Hey guys, tonight we're marching not into glory but into the grim reality of what it actually meant to serve in Napoleon's Grande Armée. Forget the paintings of heroic cavalry charges and triumphant eagles. We're talking about frostbitten feet, maggoty bread, and the kind of exhaustion that makes you wonder if dying might actually be easier than taking another step. This is the story they don't teach you in school, the one where honor gets you a shallow grave and patriotism gets you dysentery. So before you settle in for this journey through Europe's bloodiest recruiting poster, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's march together. Picture this. You're 18 years old, maybe 19 if you're lucky. You're standing in a village square somewhere in France, and a man in a blue uniform with gold braiding is telling you about glory, about serving the emperor, about how your name will be remembered alongside the heroes of history. He's got a drum, a flag, and promises that sound almost too good to be true, which, spoiler alert, they absolutely are. You don't know it yet, but you've just signed up for what might be the worst job in human history. Congratulations, you're now a soldier in Napoleon's army, and your life, assuming you keep it, is about to become a walking nightmare of mud, blood, and the kind of hunger that makes you consider whether leather tastes better boiled or raw. The recruitment process wasn't exactly what you'd call voluntary. Sure, they called it conscription, but let's be honest, it was more like organized kidnapping with paperwork. Every year, the Empire needed fresh bodies to feed into the machine, and they weren't particularly picky about whether those bodies wanted to be there. The lottery system meant your number could come up regardless of your plans, dreams, or that girl you were planning to marry next spring. If you were wealthy, you could buy your way out, pay someone else to take your place, a replacement who was usually desperate enough to risk death for a handful of coins. But if you were poor, which most people were, you got to experience the full joy of military service firsthand. The recruiters would show up in your village like tax collectors, only instead of taking your money, they were taking your sons. And once you were in, you were in. Desertion was punishable by death, though honestly, given what awaited you, some men considered it a reasonable gamble. The lucky ones got caught and shot. The unlucky ones got caught and forced to march anyway, now with the added bonus of being watched constantly and trusted by no one. Your first taste of military life began with the uniform, if you could call it that. The famous blue coat of the Grande Armée looked magnificent in paintings, but in reality, it was a poorly fitted, scratchy wool nightmare that would become your second skin for the next several years. The fabric was cheap, the stitching was cheaper, and the whole thing was designed by someone who had clearly never walked more than a few hundred yards in their entire life. The coat was supposed to last you through multiple campaigns, which meant it had to survive everything from the scorching heat of Spanish summers to the bone-cracking cold of Russian winters. It didn't. Within months, you'd be wearing a patchwork of repairs, replacements, and whatever fabric you could scavenge from the battlefield. The buttons fell off, the seams split, and the color faded to a muddy brown that matched your mood. Your trousers were white, which was perhaps the most impractical color choice in military history. They showed every stain, every splash of mud, every drop of blood. Within a week of active service, they looked like you'd been rolling around in a slaughterhouse. The fabric was thin, prone to tearing, and offered about as much protection from the elements as a prayer and a smile. The boots were the real killer, literally. Made of cheap leather with soles that wore through faster than your patience, they were designed to fall apart just as you needed them most. Blisters were guaranteed, infections were common. And when your boots finally gave up, you had two choices. Go barefoot or take them off a dead man. Most soldiers chose the latter, which meant that every battlefield became a grim shopping expedition. Your backpack, or knapsack as they called it, was your entire world compressed into a canvas bag that weighed about as much as a small person. Everything you owned had to fit inside. Spare clothes, if you had any, personal items, ammunition, cleaning supplies, and whatever food you could carry. The straps dug into your shoulders like dull knives, and after a few hours of marching, the weight would make you question every life choice that had led you to this moment. The weapon you carried was the Charleville musket, a smoothbore flintlock that was accurate to maybe 50 yards on a good day with a favorable wind. It was heavy, cumbersome, and required a 17-step loading process that you had to memorize perfectly because your life depended on it. The bayonet was sharp, which was good because you'd be using it more often than you'd like. But perhaps the most important piece of equipment was your cartridge box, filled with paper-wrapped gunpowder and musket balls. Each cartridge had to be bitten open before loading, which meant you spent most battles with a mouthful of gunpowder and the taste of paper. The powder was corrosive, the paper was often moldy, and the whole process was about as pleasant as it sounds. Now that you were properly equipped to die for France, it was time to learn how to march. And march you would, constantly, endlessly. The Grande Armée moved on foot, and that meant you moved on foot too. 20 miles a day was standard, 30 was common, 40 was not unheard of, especially when the enemy was close or winter was closing in. Your feet, already suffering in their inadequate boots, would become a constant source of agony. Every step was a negotiation between forward progress and unbearable pain. The roads were terrible when they existed at all. Most of the time you were trudging through mud that sucked at your boots like quicksand or dust that got into everything and never came out. The marching column stretched for miles, a long snake of blue-coated misery winding through the European countryside. You walked in formation or tried to, but exhaustion in terrain made it more of a suggestion than a rule. The strong helped the weak when they could. The weak fell behind and were often never seen again. Rest stops were brief and precious. When the order came to halt, you'd drop where you stood, too tired to care about comfort. Your feet would throb, your back would ache, and you'd have maybe 10 minutes before the drums started again and you had to get up and keep walking. Sleep was something you did while moving, a skill you learned quickly or paid for dearly. The weather was your constant enemy. Rain turned the roads into rivers of mud and made your wool uniform smell like a wet sheep. Snow made every step treacherous and froze your musket's firing mechanism. Heat made the marching unbearable and turned your uniform into a portable sauna. There was no good weather for a soldier, only different varieties of misery. Food was supposed to be provided by the army, but the army had bigger concerns than keeping you fed. The official ration was bread, meat, and vegetables delivered fresh and on time. In reality, you were lucky to get stale bread and whatever you could forage, steal, or scavenge. The famous phrase, "an army marches on its stomach," was true, but Napoleon's army often marched on an empty one. When supplies did arrive, they were usually spoiled, insufficient, or both. The bread was often moldy, the meat was frequently rotten, and the vegetables were whatever hadn't died on the journey. You ate it anyway because hunger was worse than food poisoning, and you never knew when the next meal might come. Foraging became a survival skill. You learned to identify edible plants, to catch and cook whatever small animals you could find, and to trade with local civilians who might have food to spare. The countryside was picked clean by armies moving through, leaving nothing but empty fields and resentful farmers. Water was another constant problem. Rivers were often polluted by the armies that had passed before you. Wells were frequently poisoned by retreating enemies. You drank what you could find and hoped for the best, knowing that bad water killed more soldiers than enemy bullets. The camp, when you finally stopped for the night, was barely more comfortable than the march. You slept on the ground, under the stars if you were lucky, in the mud if you weren't. Your blanket was thin, your pillow was your knapsack, and your bed was whatever patch of earth you could claim. Privacy was a luxury you'd forgotten existed. The cold was your greatest enemy. European winters were brutal, and soldiers' uniforms were designed more for appearance than warmth. You huddled together for heat, sharing body warmth with men who hadn't bathed in weeks. Frostbite was common, hypothermia was frequent, and many soldiers simply froze to death in their sleep. Disease spread through the camps like wildfire. Dysentery, typhus, and typhoid fever killed more soldiers than all the battles combined. Medical care was primitive at best, and often consisted of little more than amputation and prayer. The hospitals were death traps, and most soldiers preferred to suffer in silence rather than risk the cure. Your fellow soldiers became your family, whether you liked it or not. You shared everything: food, warmth, misery, and fear. The bonds formed in these conditions were stronger than blood, forged in shared suffering and mutual dependence. You looked out for each other because no one else would. But even friendship had its limits. When supplies ran short, men would steal from their comrades. When the enemy was close, panic could turn brothers in arms into enemies. And when death was certain, even the strongest bonds could break under the weight of survival instinct. The officers lived in a different world. They had better food, warmer quarters, and horses to ride instead of feet to walk on. They made the decisions that determined whether you lived or died, often from miles away and with little understanding of what those decisions meant for the men who had to carry them out. Some officers were competent, even caring. They understood that their men were human beings who needed food, rest, and leadership. But others saw soldiers as disposable resources, numbers on a ledger to be spent in pursuit of glory or promotion. Under these men, death was not just likely, but inevitable. This was your new reality. No longer the young man who had stood in that village square listening to promises of honor and adventure. You were now a small part of a vast machine designed to conquer Europe. And that machine had an insatiable appetite for human suffering. Tomorrow would bring more marching, more hunger, more cold, and the constant possibility of death. But tonight, as you lay on the hard ground listening to the snores and moans of your fellow soldiers, you might wonder if this was really what glory looked like. The answer, as you were beginning to learn, was that glory was something that happened to other people. Usually people who didn't have to sleep in the mud. Battle, when it finally came, was nothing like the paintings. No heroic charges across pristine fields, no noble cavalry with flowing banners, no dramatic last stands against a crimson sunset. Real battle was chaos wrapped in terror, seasoned with the kind of confusion that made you question whether you were shooting at the right people. The night before a fight, you'd lie awake listening to the sounds of an army preparing to die, men writing letters they'd never send, praying to gods they'd ignored for months, and making promises they'd never have to keep. Some soldiers cleaned their muskets obsessively, as if perfect maintenance could somehow deflect enemy bullets. Others just stared into the darkness, already seeing their own deaths in the shadows. When morning came, it brought the drumbeat. Not the inspiring rhythm of recruitment marches, but a slow, methodical pounding that seemed to echo from inside your chest. This was the call to formation, the sound that meant your comfortable misery was about to be replaced by something infinitely worse. You'd stumble to your feet, muscles stiff from sleeping on frozen ground, and join the long blue lines that stretched across whatever field would become that day's slaughterhouse. The officers would ride up and down the ranks, shouting orders and encouragement that nobody could hear over the sound of their own heartbeat. Your mouth would be dry as sand. Your hands would shake as you checked your cartridge box for the 100th time. And somewhere in the distance, you'd hear the same sounds coming from the enemy lines. The waiting was the worst part. Hours sometimes, standing in formation, while generals moved pieces around like a chess game played with human lives. Your legs would cramp, your bladder would demand attention, and the man next to you might vomit from pure terror. All perfectly normal reactions that nobody talked about because admitting fear was somehow worse than dying afraid. When the order finally came to advance, you'd move forward in a line that was supposed to be straight but never was. Men stumbled, fell behind, or simply stopped walking because their courage had finally run out. The sergeants would scream and threaten, but their voices were lost in the growing roar of thousands of boots hitting the earth in something that resembled unison. The first volley from the enemy was always the worst. You'd see the smoke, hear the crack of muskets, and then men around you would simply drop. Not dramatically, not with final words or heroic gestures. They'd just crumple like marionettes with cut strings, leaving bloody gaps in the line that closed up automatically because that's what you'd been trained to do. Your turn to fire would come eventually. You'd bite open a cartridge, pour the powder down the barrel, ram home the ball, and aim at a mass of enemy soldiers who were doing exactly the same thing to you. The musket would kick against your shoulder, the smoke would blind you, and you'd have no idea whether your shot had hit anything or anyone. Then you'd reload and do it again and again until your shoulder was bruised, your ears were ringing, and the taste of gunpowder had replaced every other flavor in your mouth. Close combat was where the real nightmare began. When the lines finally met, when bayonets crossed and men fought hand to hand, all pretense of civilized warfare disappeared. You'd stab at shapes in the smoke, never sure if you were killing enemies or friends. The sounds were inhuman, grunts and screams and the wet noise of steel entering flesh. Your training would take over, muscle memory driving you to kill or be killed, while your mind tried desperately to disconnect from what your body was doing. The wounded were everywhere, crawling between the fighting men like broken toys. Some begged for help, others for death, and most just lay there bleeding quietly while the battle raged around them. You'd step on them, trip over them, and try not to look at their faces because recognizing them would make it worse. Artillery was the great equalizer, caring nothing for courage or cowardice. Cannonballs would tear through the ranks, taking off heads and limbs with casual indifference. The sound was unlike anything else, a whistle followed by an explosion that left your ears ringing and your vision blurred. Men would simply disappear, there one moment and gone the next, leaving behind only bloody rags and the memory of their last words. If you survived the first hour, you might survive the battle. But survival wasn't victory, it was just permission to keep suffering. You'd look around at what was left of your company, counting familiar faces and noting their absence. The ground would be carpeted with bodies, French and enemy alike, their blood mixing in the mud until nationality became meaningless. The aftermath was its own kind of hell. You'd walk among the dead and dying, looking for friends and trying not to see enemies. The wounded would call out for water, for their mothers, for someone to end their pain. Some you could help, most you couldn't, and all of them would haunt your dreams for whatever remained of your life. Looting was expected, even encouraged. Dead men had no use for coins, watches, or personal effects, and living soldiers needed whatever they could find. You'd search through pockets still warm with someone else's blood, taking what you needed and trying not to think about the letters you'd found. The pictures of wives and children who would never see their loved ones again. The burial details were the worst duty of all. Hundreds of bodies, stiffening in the cold, had to be dragged to mass graves and dumped in without ceremony. You'd grab an arm or a leg, trying not to look at the face, and heave the corpse into a pit that would be covered with lime and dirt. Your own friends, men you'd shared bread with just yesterday, would receive the same treatment as the enemies you'd killed. Disease followed battle like a faithful hound. Wounds that should have healed became infected in the filthy conditions. Dysentery spread through the ranks, weakening men who had survived enemy bullets only to be felled by their own bodily functions. The field hospitals were charnel houses where amputation was the answer to every problem, and death was often a mercy. The psychological toll was something no one prepared you for. You'd find yourself jumping at shadows, unable to sleep without seeing the faces of men you'd killed. The constant noise of battle would echo in your ears long after the guns had fallen silent. Some men cracked completely, wandering away from camp to be found days later, raving about ghosts and demons that only they could see. Veterans developed a 1,000-yard stare, a hollow look that came from seeing too much death and dealing too much of it. They'd sit around campfires sharing stories that grew more horrific with each telling, laughing at things that should have made them weep. It was a defense mechanism, a way of processing trauma that had no name and no cure. The lucky ones died quickly. A musket ball to the head, a bayonet through the heart, a cannonball that ended everything in an instant. They were spared the slow agony of infection, the lingering death of gangrene, the madness that came from too many battles and too little hope. But you weren't lucky. You were alive, which meant you'd have to do it all again tomorrow or next week or whenever the generals decided that another piece of European real estate needed to be painted red with French blood. You'd march to the next battlefield, form up in the same lines, and play the same deadly game with slightly different rules. This was war as Napoleon's soldiers knew it. Not the glorious adventure promised by recruiters, but a grinding, dehumanizing experience that turned young men into hollow-eyed killers and idealistic boys into cynical survivors. The lucky ones learned to stop feeling. The unlucky ones felt everything until the day they died. And through it all, the machine kept grinding, consuming men and nations with equal appetite, leaving behind a trail of graves and broken dreams that stretched from the Atlantic to the steppes of Russia. You were just one small part of that machine, expendable and easily replaced, marching toward a destiny that cared nothing for your hopes, your fears, or your life. Between battles, when the drums weren't calling you to die and the officers weren't screaming about honor, you discovered that boredom could be its own special kind of torture. The gaps between campaigns weren't rest periods. They were extended previews of hell, where you had nothing to do but think about what had happened and what was coming next. Camp life was a masterclass in human degradation. You'd wake up in the same clothes you'd worn for weeks, surrounded by men who smelled like they'd been dead for days but were unfortunately still breathing. The stench was beyond description, a mixture of unwashed bodies, rotting food, human waste, and the lingering smell of gunpowder that seemed to cling to everything like a curse. Your daily routine was designed by someone who clearly hated the human spirit. Dawn brought inspection, where officers would examine your equipment and find fault with everything. Your musket wasn't clean enough. Your uniform wasn't pressed, which was impossible since you'd been sleeping in it. Your boots were scuffed, assuming you still had boots. The punishment for these infractions was usually more work, as if you didn't have enough already. Drill practice consumed hours of your day, endless repetition of movements you'd already memorized. Load, aim, fire, reload, march left, march right, form square, break formation. The sergeants would scream commands until their voices cracked, and you'd obey because the alternative was a flogging that would leave your back looking like raw meat. The food, when it existed, was an insult to the concept of nutrition. Hardtack biscuits that could break teeth, meat that had gone green around the edges, and soup that was mostly water with a few vegetables floating in it like tiny life rafts. You'd eat it anyway because hunger was worse than food poisoning, and you never knew when the next meal might come. Water was a constant problem. Rivers were polluted by the armies that had passed before you. Wells were often poisoned by retreating enemies, and what you could find was usually brown and tasted like it had been filtered through a graveyard. You drank it anyway because thirst was worse than dysentery, and dysentery was just another fact of military life. The latrines were holes in the ground surrounded by flies and the kind of smell that made you question whether humans were truly God's greatest creation. Privacy was non-existent. Dignity was a luxury you'd forgotten, and the constant threat of disease meant that relieving yourself was always a gamble with death. Sleep was something you did in shifts, always with one eye open and one hand on your musket. The ground was hard, the blankets were thin, and the nights were cold enough to freeze your breath. You'd huddle together for warmth, sharing body heat with men who hadn't bathed in weeks and probably never would again. Letters from home were rare and precious, but they were also torture. News of births you'd missed, deaths you couldn't mourn, and marriages that had happened without you. Your family seemed to exist in a different world, one where people worried about harvests and weather instead of bullets and bayonets. The gap between their reality and yours was unbridgeable, and every letter reminded you of what you'd lost. Some men wrote letters they'd never send, pouring their hearts out to wives and mothers who would never read the words. Others kept journals, recording their thoughts and experiences in scratchy handwriting that grew more illegible with each passing day. Most just tried not to think about home at all because thinking about it made everything worse. Gambling was the universal pastime, men betting their meager pay on cards, dice, or anything else that might provide a momentary distraction from reality. Money changed hands constantly, and fortunes were made and lost on the turn of a card. The lucky ones won enough to buy extra food or a dry place to sleep. The unlucky ones lost everything and had to borrow against future pay that they might not live to collect. Drinking was another escape. When alcohol could be found or stolen, men would drink anything that might dull the pain. From captured wine to industrial alcohol that could blind you if you weren't careful. The hangovers were legendary, but they were preferable to sobriety, which meant facing reality without any buffer between you and the horror of your situation. Violence was casual and constant. Men would fight over scraps of food, dry places to sleep, or imagined slights that in normal circumstances would be forgotten in minutes. The officers turned a blind eye to most of it, knowing that soldiers needed some outlet for their frustration and rage. As long as no one was killed, a few broken bones were considered normal. Theft was epidemic. Men would steal from each other, from local civilians and from the enemy dead. Personal property was meaningless when survival was at stake, and trust was a luxury that few could afford. You'd sleep with your possessions tied to your body, knowing that anything left unguarded would disappear by morning. The medical care was primitive at best. Army surgeons were often barbers who'd been given a saw and told to figure it out. Their solution to most problems was amputation, performed without anesthesia while the patient was held down by his comrades. The mortality rate was staggering, and many men preferred to suffer in silence rather than risk the cure. Disease was everywhere. Dysentery, typhus, typhoid, and a dozen other ailments spread through the camps like wildfire. Men would sicken and die in days, their bodies unable to fight off infections that would be minor inconveniences in peacetime. The hospitals were death traps, and most soldiers avoided them unless they were already unconscious. The lucky ones died quickly. A fever that took them in their sleep, a wound that became infected and ended their suffering, or simply the gradual wearing down of a body that had endured too much. They were spared the slow agony of watching their friends die one by one, the gradual erosion of hope, and the growing certainty that they would never see home again. Mental breakdown was common but never discussed. Men would simply stop speaking, stop eating, stop caring about anything at all. They'd wander around camp like ghosts, performing their duties mechanically while their minds retreated to some private hell. The officers called it cowardice, but their comrades knew better. It was what happened when a human being was pushed beyond their breaking point. Some men found religion clutching at faith like a drowning man clutches at driftwood. They'd pray constantly, attend every service, and carry religious medals that they believed would protect them from harm. Others lost faith entirely, deciding that no benevolent God would allow such suffering to exist. Both groups were probably right. The worst part was the waiting. Waiting for orders, waiting for supplies, waiting for the next battle that might kill you or your friends. Time moved differently in the army, stretching endlessly during the boring parts and compressing into terrifying moments when death was seconds away. You'd spend weeks doing nothing, then minutes fighting for your life, then weeks again thinking about what you'd seen and done. Rumors spread through the camps like disease. Stories of victories and defeats, of reinforcements coming or supplies running out, of peace negotiations or new wars beginning. Most of it was false, but you listened anyway, because hope was sometimes the only thing keeping you sane. The hierarchy was absolute and brutal. Officers lived in a different world, with better food, warmer quarters, and horses to ride instead of feet to walk on. They made decisions that determined whether you lived or died, often from miles away and with little understanding of what those decisions meant for the men who had to carry them out. Promotion was possible, but rare. A few men might rise through the ranks, earning stripes and slightly better treatment. But most would remain common soldiers until they died, their names forgotten and their sacrifices unrecorded. The idea of becoming an officer was a fantasy that kept some men going even though they knew it would probably never happen. This was your life now. Not the adventure promised by recruiters, but a grinding, dehumanizing experience that wore down your body and soul with each passing day. You were part of a machine designed to conquer Europe, and that machine had an insatiable appetite for human suffering. Tomorrow would bring more of the same. More drill, more hunger, more disease, and the constant possibility of death. But tonight, as you lay on the hard ground listening to the snores and moans of your fellow soldiers, you might wonder if this was really what serving the Emperor looked like. The answer, as you were learning every day, was that glory was something that happened to other people. Usually people who didn't have to sleep in the mud and dream of home. And then came the retreat. The word itself was forbidden, whispered only in the darkest corners of camp when the officers weren't listening. Napoleon's armies didn't retreat. They conducted strategic withdrawals, tactical repositioning, anything but the simple truth that you were running for your lives. The retreat from Moscow was the masterpiece of military horror, a symphony of suffering that would make hell itself seem like a vacation. You'd survived the march into Russia, somehow lived through the burning of Moscow, and now you were walking back across 1,000 miles of frozen wasteland, with winter snapping at your heels like a rabid dog. The cold was beyond description. Not the uncomfortable chill of a European winter, but a living thing that crawled inside your clothes and gnawed at your bones. Your breath froze in the air before you could exhale it fully. Your musket became too cold to touch with bare hands, and your hands were too numb to feel the trigger anyway. Men would simply stop walking, sit down in the snow, and quietly freeze to death while their comrades stepped over them. Your boots, already falling apart after months of marching, disintegrated completely in the Russian cold. You wrapped your feet in rags, in pieces of dead men's clothing, in anything that might provide a barrier between your flesh and the ice. But nothing worked for long. Frostbite was inevitable, and you learned to recognize the signs. The tingling sensation, then numbness, then the blackening of toes and fingers that meant amputation was your best hope. The supply lines had collapsed completely. There was no food, no ammunition, no medical supplies. You ate whatever you could find. Leather from dead horses, bark from trees, sometimes things that had once been human but were now just frozen meat. Cannibalism wasn't discussed, but it happened. Survival stripped away every pretense of civilization, leaving only the animal instinct to keep breathing for one more day. The landscape was littered with abandoned equipment, cannons left in the snow because the horses were dead and the men were too weak to pull them. Wagons loaded with supplies that no one had the strength to move. Personal belongings scattered across the frozen ground like the debris of a shattered dream. You'd see a painting of someone's family half buried in a snowdrift, and you'd wonder if the man who carried it was still alive or just another body under the ice. Stamtal. The Russian cavalry harassed you constantly, appearing from nowhere to cut down stragglers and disappear back into the white void. They didn't need to fight battles, they just needed to wait for the cold to do their work for them. Every day, the Grande Armée grew smaller, not from combat, but from simple human endurance pushed beyond its limits. Disease ran rampant through the retreating columns. Typhus, dysentery, pneumonia, and a dozen other ailments that thrived in the filthy, weakened conditions. Men would collapse and die while walking, their bodies finally giving up the fight. The lucky ones died quickly. The unlucky ones lingered, begging for help that no one could provide, until the cold claimed them too. The officers tried to maintain discipline, but their authority was evaporating like breath in the frozen air. What did rank matter when everyone was dying? What did orders mean when following them was suicide? Some officers abandoned their men and fled ahead, hoping to save themselves. Others stayed and died with their soldiers, sharing the same fate they'd led them into. You learned to sleep while walking, a skill that would have seemed impossible months ago. Your body would keep moving while your mind shut down, following the man in front of you like a sleepwalker. Sometimes you'd wake up and find yourself alone, separated from your unit in the endless white expanse. Finding them again was a matter of luck, and luck was in short supply. The retreat became a race against time and weather. Every day the cold grew worse. Every day more men died. Every day the distance to safety seemed to stretch further. You'd count your steps, then your breaths, then your heartbeats. Anything to keep your mind occupied while your body performed the mechanical task of putting one foot in front of the other. Rivers became death traps. The ice was often too thin to support the weight of men and equipment, but too thick to break through for water. You'd watch as entire companies would disappear through the ice, their screams muffled by the snow and wind. The survivors would keep walking because stopping meant joining them under the frozen water. The Russian winter showed no mercy. Blizzards would strike without warning, turning the world into a white hell where you couldn't see your own hands. The wind would cut through your inadequate clothing like knives, and the snow would blind you until you lost all sense of direction. Men would wander in circles until they collapsed from exhaustion, their bodies found days later frozen solid. By the time the remnants of the Grande Armée crossed back into friendly territory, you were no longer the same person who had marched into Russia. You were a hollow-eyed ghost, a walking skeleton wrapped in rags and held together by sheer stubborn will. Of the 600,000 men who had started the campaign, fewer than 30,000 would return in fighting condition. The others were scattered across the Russian steppes, buried under snow or left to rot in the spring thaw. Their names were forgotten, their sacrifices unrecorded, their dreams buried with them in unmarked graves. They had marched to Moscow believing in glory and empire, and they had died believing in nothing at all. You were one of the lucky ones. You had survived when so many others hadn't, but survival came with its own price. The nightmares that would wake you screaming the way your hands shook when you tried to hold a cup. The constant fear that the cold would return and finish what it had started. You were alive, but you were also broken in ways that would never heal. And the worst part, Napoleon was already planning the next campaign. The machine needed fresh bodies, new recruits to replace the ones who had been ground up in the Russian winter. Young men who would listen to the same promises of glory and honor that had once convinced you to join. The cycle would continue, and the fields of Europe would be fertilized with French blood for years to come. So there you have it, the truth about serving in Napoleon's army. Stripped of romance and scrubbed clean of glory. You didn't die for France. You died for one man's ambition, frozen in a Russian snowfield or bleeding out in a Spanish olive grove or rotting in a German hospital. Your name wasn't remembered, your sacrifice wasn't honored, and your death changed nothing except the number on a casualty report. The paintings show eagles and banners, cavalry charges, and heroic last stands, but you knew the reality. Frost-bitten feet and empty stomachs, disease and desertion, the slow grinding away of everything that made you human. You served not because you believed in the cause, but because you had no choice. And you died not because you were brave, but because you were unlucky. This was Napoleon's army. Not the legend, but the truth. And the truth, as you learned too late, was that glory was always someone else's story, usually written by people who had never slept in the mud or dreamed of home while marching toward their graves. The drumbeat that had once called you to adventure now echoed only in your nightmares, a rhythm that matched the sound of your own heart slowly breaking. And somewhere in the distance you could hear it starting again, calling a new generation of young men to their own appointment with history's meat grinder. The war didn't end when you finally made it home. It followed you like a faithful dog, padding silently behind you through the streets of the village you'd left as a boy and returned to as a broken man. The faces were the same, but the eyes that looked at you weren't. They saw something in you that made them uncomfortable, something that reminded them of things they'd rather forget. You'd wake up screaming in the night, your hands clawing at imaginary enemies while your family watched helplessly from the doorway. The sound of thunder would send you diving for cover, your body remembering the whistle of cannonballs and the crack of musket fire. A church bell ringing would make you reach for a weapon that wasn't there, your mind still trapped in a world where every sound meant danger. The nightmares were the worst part. You'd dream of faces men you'd killed or watched die, their eyes following you through landscapes made of snow and blood. You'd wake up with their names on your lips, names you'd never known in life but somehow remembered perfectly in death. The ghosts of the Grande Armée had followed you home, and they weren't planning to leave. Your body was a catalog of injuries that would never fully heal. The frostbite scars on your feet that made every step a reminder of Russian snow. The badly set bones that ached when the weather changed. The lung damage from breathing smoke and gunpowder for years. You were 25 years old and felt like an old man worn down by experiences that had aged you decades in just a few years. Work was nearly impossible. Your hands shook too much for delicate tasks. Your concentration was shattered by memories that struck without warning. The simple act of farming, something you'd done all your life before the war, now seemed alien and strange. The sound of a plow cutting through earth reminded you of shovels digging graves. The sight of red soil looked too much like blood. People would thank you for your service, but their gratitude felt hollow. They'd talk about glory and honor while you remembered the taste of human flesh and the sound of your friends dying in the snow. They'd speak of Napoleon's greatness while you recalled the emperor's complete indifference to the suffering of his soldiers. Their words were meant to comfort, but they only highlighted the gap between what they imagined war to be and what you knew it actually was. The worst part was the silence. You couldn't talk about what you'd seen, what you'd done, what you'd become. Who would believe you? Who would understand? The official histories were already being written, tales of heroic sacrifice and glorious victory. Your truth, the real truth of mud and blood and slow starvation, didn't fit the narrative, so you kept it locked inside where it ate away at you like a cancer. Some of your fellow survivors had found ways to cope. They drank themselves to death, slowly but surely, drowning their memories in whatever alcohol they could find. Others simply disappeared, walking away from their old lives and vanishing into the anonymity of distant cities. A few found peace in religion, though you wondered if they truly believed or just desperately wanted to. But most, like you, just endured. You woke up each morning and put one foot in front of the other, not because you wanted to, but because you'd forgotten how to do anything else. You'd learned to march through hell itself. And now you were marching through a different kind of hell. One where the enemy was inside your own head and the battlefield was your own memories. The empire was crumbling. Napoleon's star was falling, and with it the illusion that all the death and suffering had been for something greater. The man you'd served, the God Emperor who had promised to remake Europe, was just another mortal after all. His defeat at Waterloo came as no surprise to you. You'd seen the machine breaking down from the inside, consuming itself in its hunger for more blood and more conquest, and so you lived, if you could call it that. Not the life you'd planned, not the future you dreamed of, but the only life you had left. You were a survivor of Napoleon's army, a graduate of Europe's greatest school of human suffering. You'd learned lessons that no one should have to learn, and you carried knowledge that no one wanted to hear. The drumbeat had finally stopped. The machine had ground to a halt, rusted with blood and choked with bones. But for you, the war would never truly end. It lived in your dreams, in your scars, in the way you flinched at sudden noises and the way you counted your steps when you walked. You were home, but you would never truly be home again. This was the real cost of serving in Napoleon's army, not just the chance of death, but the certainty of being forever changed by what you'd seen and done. You'd marched into history and come back haunted, a living reminder of the price of one man's ambition and the true meaning of glory